So, Rebecca, speed round emails. What do you say?
This is fun for me.
Listener Vernie from Ohio says, I'm a single mom and the legal guardian of a 27-year-old daughter with disabilities who thinks she has a right to veto me on various decisions, from home decor to proper healthcare decisions. I'm struggling to understand her wishes versus what I feel is right as a parent. I know she has rights, but when it comes to her health, I feel like I have the final word. But she is fighting me at every step. I don't know where to turn. How do I deal with my adult daughter with disabilities thinking she has a say in decisions that I make, even over the most trivial of things? Rebecca, what do you think?
So this is really common for adults who live at home with disabilities. They're trying to individuate, but they can't due to their reliance on their parents. And so this is why some folks don't live at home, but live at a group home, or that there is another party involved to get out of these power struggles. And also, I would ask mom, are you part of any support group that can help you? Because this issue is so common. And, I mean, you're talking about your child's health, but they're also an adult. But they also really need you. And so there's this extreme tension that just goes on and on. So I would say reach out.
Yeah.
Get help. And any family has these struggles, and maybe there's family meeting night where, you can pick, your daughter can decorate one room and the rest of the house is yours. You pay for the house, just like those rules are set up in a lot of houses. But you're going to have to decide where there's wiggle room, and then the extreme tension where there's not wiggle room. And that's really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. And I don't know the disability that your daughter has or what the circumstances are, but what I'll additionally say is that if you're all alone in doing this, that's a lot to ask, even if there wasn't this vetoing and power struggle and individuation. So hopefully you have other people that are helping. Maybe it's a professional, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member, I don't know. There's also respite care. Sometimes you can get paid for by agencies or the government because it'll just give you a break, so that because it sounds like you're burning out in general, right? The other, but there are a number of questions that, and if it's worth it, I would seek out a family therapist that understands this sort of thing to explore these questions, because it's possible that, I've worked with a lot of families in this situation, and I don't know which one that you fit into, obviously, but there are some parents who, for good reasons, based on the past, are terrified of allowing their child to make independent decisions because they had disastrous situations. For example, being sexually assaulted because you let them hang out with friends one day, or being abused in some other way, or I don't know, just absolute mistreatment because the child asked for freedoms, you gave it to them, and some horrific thing happened. And you have a lot of worries and a lot of concerns, and so that is real, and that's good. But sometimes when you clamp down really hard, the adult child with a disability notices that and feels like it's too restrictive, in the same way that every 13-year-old might think it's too restrictive. So sometimes you have to think, am I going too far with this, and where's that line? And there's a pretty big range there in terms of what's quote unquote acceptable, right? It's for some parents who are like, well, something bad could happen, but my kid is just not going to live with all these restrictions, so I've got to let go of a couple things. Even around health, like one of the decisions that you run into if you're in that position, and this can apply to an adult kid with ADHD or adult kid with a personality disorder, that at a certain point, and it's really hard to make this choice, and it's impossible to know what the right thing to do is, but sometimes parents will wisely say, even though I know they're going to screw their life up, I'm going to let them. Because me constantly bumping up against them and trying to protect them from themselves is just it's not worth it anymore. It's not worth it to me. It's not worth it to our relationship. And they're not learning. I keep telling them they can't do this, and they keep wanting to do it. And it kills me to think that I'm going to let them have this freedom, and this horrible thing is going to happen to them, either academically, career-wise, socially, health-wise. And I hope that they can learn from that decision. That you can make that that decision. But what a lot of parents will say to me when I propose this, I'm not saying they should do it because I never can know, but I'll just throw it out there. They'll say, "Oh, so I'm just supposed to give up?" Every time the parent will say this, it's clockwork. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm not saying. Give up. It's not. But to them, it's black and white. It's either I exert full control and replace their superego with my, decision making, or I give up. And it's like, no, there's a middle ground there that I understand why you have foregone because of issues in the past, but now is the time to start to go there. And it's a totally viable strategy of just like, well, kid, I know you're going to I'm pretty sure you're going to screw this up, but you're entitled to do that. And when you learn from it, I will not say I told you so, but I'll be thinking it. I'll be thinking it. And if you want me to help you after that point, I might have some boundaries around it because I told you, but you're allowed to make that choice. And I pray to God that you make the best choice. That is an important element. I mean, I'm sure you've run into that with your own kid.
I'm actually thinking of two. I don't do well as a therapist. There's a certain type of parent who comes to me as a client who ends up firing me because they don't like what I have to say to them about their disabled children. One of which is you can't make your child undisabled by constantly shoving resources at them. Your child will be delayed, and that is okay. And
there's this notion, particularly on Facebook, that if you just do the right thing, it'll all go away. There's this American notion as well of you take this pill or this dietary regimen, and your child's ADHD will disappear. And it's just like, no, it's just not going to happen. Yeah. So, I just want to say that I know that for parents whose children have disabilities, you are working so hard that it is hard to change the way that you have gotten to this point and kept your child alive. But that sometimes you might need to change a little bit for the way things are going. So I'm thinking recently of a parent I was working with whose child is very behind in reading, and they're just devastated. And there was an article that came out just last week that 90% of children who don't have disabilities, their reading is behind because of the pandemic. And, I'll say something like, maybe this isn't the time to really push your child academically. Yeah. I've said that in a bunch of settings. I said that as part of the PTA at my child's high school. And just the reaction is like, how can you? You have to, I mean, we've talked about. We've either talked about this on or off the air, but I cannot tell you how many times I am just like, people, there are other things besides grades. You understand that, right? The universe does not revolve around the fact that your kid gets a grade in a class. Like, life moves on, and plenty of people succeed and are happy in life who got C's or F's even. Like, just let it go, people. Like, it's just a maddening focus that people will have, particularly Asian parents. So I'm Asian, and I can't tell you how many times I will have this argument with people, and it always comes down to this one thing that I'll say is like, would you rather have a doctor who was the top of his class, who's an asshole and no one likes, or a janitor that everyone likes? Which one would you like? And parents will not know how to answer that question. Yeah. Because they want to say a doctor that no one likes, but they know they're not supposed to. And that's the amount of materialistic, capitalistic brainwashing that parents are under. And of course, teachers are incentivized to believe in this too. And for a lot of parents, their only mentors, so to speak, are the teachers. And teachers are self-interested in getting the kids to value education, which I understand, but and because when I have this conversation with teachers, and God help me if I'm talking to a parent who's a teacher, it's just like, yes, grades are important. I got straight A's. I was a nerd. I'm a professor, for crying out loud. I understand that education is important, but to sacrifice everything else for it, it's like, no, stop it. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'm 100% with you. And when your kid has a disability, so my own therapist is working with me right now as I work to launch my kid into adulthood on the myth of Sleeping Beauty and how you do everything in the world to protect your child, and then in the end you can't protect them. And the bad things happen. And
how does that happen in the Sleeping Beauty?
Sleeping Beauty, she is cursed at the beginning of the story by one of the evil fairies who says you will prick your finger on a spinning wheel and it will kill you. And then one of the other fairies comes in and says, no, it'll just put you to sleep. And so her parents remove every spinning wheel from the entire land so that their daughter will never find a spinning wheel and will never touch it. But one day when she's in her early teens, she wanders off and finds a spinning needle and touches it and falls asleep. And of course, then it's the patriarchal myth that she needs a man to kiss her and blah, 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 blah. But this idea that...
Non-consensually, by the way.
But this idea that we can stop people from failing, and that, as parents, if we just pave the way and make sure everything's okay, obviously it makes much less work for us, but then, our kids don't learn and they don't go out in the world.
So just think about, you and I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. Parents didn't give a crap about what we were doing back then. And imagine all the stupid shit that we learned and how wise we are today because of it. Like, just imagine if our parents protected us from all of those. And the other nice thing that you can say to yourself as a parent, would you rather have your kid make a really dumb mistake at 15 or 35? It's much easier to handle when you're 15 because it's expected and the consequences are far less. And all their other cohort people are doing the same thing. So you want your kid to be making mistakes. You want them to be getting hurt sometimes within reason. I'm not saying complete freedoms, of course, but the principle should be there of all of the top 5 principles that I follow. One of them is I want them to make mistakes they can learn from.
And that in discussions like this, especially with health, I would bring in the big guns. I wouldn't have that discussion alone with your adult child. I would have a doctor present or someone else present that's been in their lives a while, because those discussions are really, really hard and they might not be able to hear it from you.
Yeah. Getting back to the emailer, I have no idea. I'm not Vernie. I'm not really specifically talking to you. Obviously, I'm sort of yelling at the clients that I would have.
Yelling at the cosmos.
So for you, it's hard to know, obviously. But, from my experience as a family therapist, I just can't tell you how many times I would be having this frustrating conversation with parents. And, another thing that I would say is it's great that you care and it's great that you are trying to be a responsible parent. And some of your friends might have kids that are totally fine with if you just replaced your kid with some other kid, they probably would be fine. But your kid does not like that. There's something about your kid. We could debate as to how we got here, but we've crossed the Rubicon. They do not want that kind of restrictions. They really want their freedoms. And there's a standard deviation here that we can start to play with that is within reason, that might not be the average, and might not be something you're comfortable with, but might be a little bit more freedom. I'm not saying you're supposed to do that, because I'm not you, and I'll support you whatever you do. And this is always when the kid's not in the room, but if you decide to even be more strict, and I'm not going to undermine you to your kid, just know that. But I'm telling you that if you continue to go down this road, your kid will continue to resent you and fall out of love with you. Your kid will not love you anymore. That's kind of the direction we're headed. And once they don't love you anymore, all bets are off. They won't listen to a single thing you say. So is that really what you want? A 25-year-old who complies but hates you? And it's not your fault. There's no rule that you're imposing here that is irrational or unfair. These are all fair rules, but there's something about your kid that we have to adjust to. And if you family right here grew up in any other time, in any other culture, he'd already be an adult. He'd already be learning a trade and working or working the fields or something, and he would have those freedoms. So understand that our culture today, although it's not pathological in this way, but it definitely doesn't favor those kids who naturally want freedoms a little earlier. In the past, it'd be totally fine, and the kids who want to be pampered past 15 would be the weirdos. So it's just a matter of perspective. But we're just reminded of this rant that I would go on with the parents, that I'd get them to move like 0.1% in the direction that I was hoping. It was entrenched. It was so hard to get them out of that. Because for every me, there was a Dr. Phil episode about a boot camp situation where there's a sergeant yelling at kids to comply.
Right.
And and I would get parents asking me like, "Oh, I saw this boot camp thing on Dr. Phil. Can we sign up for something like that?" And I'm just like, well, yeah, but let me tell you the actual success rate of those things. It's really horrible. They will claim they have a 95% success rate, but they do not, believe me. Anyway. Listener, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say one thing is that listener, I know how much you love your child, and you're coming from this of a place of love. And I just want to tell you that you're doing a really good job of parenting this child. It sounds like pretty much on your own.
Right.
And that has been exhausting and draining and relentless.
Yeah.
And if there's any way to take a break and go back to these issues with fresh eyes. Because you can really get stuck in a power struggle with your kid.
Yeah. Yeah, these people are saints, and thanks for highlighting that parents who take care of their kids with disabilities into their adult life. When you have a kid, you think, well, I got about 18, 22 years of struggle. But one day they'll move out and they'll be independent, everything. But you have a kid with disabilities, it can last potentially for the rest of your life. And it's just supposed to be, it's like, well, of course that's what you're going to do, because you're her mom. Like, what kind of mom just puts their kid in an institution? Or, it's like you don't have any options, and maybe you don't want to let go. Maybe you do feel good overall about taking care of the kid, but it's a lot of emotional work, and there's no award ceremony for these kinds of parents. Listener Helen from Canada says, how should a grad student approach abuse from their faculty, staff, and advisors? I feel as though this is an all too common experience within academia, which drives potential scholars away from pursuing higher education, particularly now that remote learning has greatly eliminated interpersonal support within the current cohorts. I have found that as long as the abuse does not cross the threshold into physical or sexual territory, it is often ignored or discounted. I feel that with your platform and your experience and expertise in the field, you could help a lot of budding researchers who are suffering in silence. Rebecca, I knew you would have things to say about this, because that's why I included this in your document, but what do you think?
So these issues are really hard. You're actually, your teacher has a boss, so you can always go to the dean and talk it out there.
Or there's a student advocacy professional or department or something. Not necessarily your professor's boss, but like a it's kind of like an internal affairs watchdog on the student experience. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, I've been accused of being too much. And so I just want to, it's hard. I know here, I'll just talk about a client I had who was in a research position where her doctoral professor would not pass her and made her stay for years continuing to do research, and she finally broke free. And I think of her a lot, is that, you know, he kept promising this carrot at the end of the story with this research that was not coming through the way that he wanted to, and it was abuse. That she was stuck and being told like she would not get this PhD because, you know, she didn't fulfill this project, which was going, you know, she was giving years away. So I would get another pair of eyes on this. And I know with remote learning, it's so much harder, but make sure you're talking through the details with someone. And if it's truly abuse, you need to get out of that situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I have been a victim of academic abuse, if you will, emotionally abused by professors and supervisors. I, in my career, have had, you know, dozens and dozens of professors and something like 20 supervisors. And especially in my field, you would think that, at least I thought, that wouldn't occur. But I learned very quickly, my very first supervisor, or actually, well, anyway, an early supervisor I had was abusive and harmful to me in very obvious ways. Looking back, it's like, wow, like, what was wrong with that guy? Like, how could you possibly do that to me at the time? And I write about it all in my book on supervision. It's the first chapter. It's what's motivated me, partially, to become a better supervisor and to write that book. But anyway, it happens. It's shocking. It's unfair. I understand it. There aren't, you know, if you tell your friends, they might be like, well, just quit or something. And it's like, yeah, okay, just throw away $200,000 of debt, throw away all that work, because you can't really transfer often credits to other institutions. Plus, do you really want to start over? It's getting a degree is really a unique experience human-wise. Like, it's all frequently we're investing everything, heart, soul, mind, body, spirit, into this endeavor, and to just throw it all away is really awful. So and you can't guarantee that if you do jump ship, that they're not going to alert the other institution and bar you from actually getting anywhere else. And so, you know, it's kind of a no-win situation, because academics have so much power over students. Because it's similar kind of to therapy, in that if a client comes to experiences abuse from a therapist, the therapist can, and sometimes does, just say, well, they're crazy, essentially. You know, they don't use that word, but they'll say, well, because of their disorder, because they're borderline, they're distorted, da, da, da. The accused actually has tremendous amount of privilege and power of interpretation and clinical expertise and clout, if you will. And academics is the same way. A professor can say, well, that student just didn't write a good paper, and it's kind of, or their conduct in class was unprofessional. And it's kind of up to the eye of the beholder, right? What one person's unprofessionalism is another person's, you know, talkativeness or something. And it gets in this really gray area, and depending, the powers that be in the institution has somewhat of, they're kind of in a bind. Sometimes they will side against the professor unfairly, I will say, and sometimes they will side against the student unfairly, because the administration often are interested in profit. They're interested in continuing to be able to produce this service, which means that if a student is coming across as unruly, sometimes it's like, well, we don't want to be sued, and so we'll just please the student at the expense of the program, or we don't want to create a situation where the student is causing more problems, so we're just going to kick them out even though they don't deserve it. Anyway, the point is that as a student, and I've experienced this as a victim of abuse myself from academics as a student when I was a student. And just to give you some context, at the time I was being abused, I was also a professor and an employee of Antioch. We were friends at the time, Rebecca. And I was a professor in the psychology program at Antioch University, also a student in another program in the psychology department, being abused by my coworkers, aka my professors. And I had a lot of power. I had more power than any other student has ever had in that program. And yet I was completely powerless, especially in psychology, because when I did talk about it, tried to, it was just pushed back in my face. For example, do I go into specifics? But what do I say? Anyway, the point is that it was turned around on me, that the professors, once I started to speak up about it, they would turn it around and say, well, obviously you're only saying that because of the complaint we have against you, essentially like that. And it wasn't until I found professors who had power, who were sane and would listen to me and give me the benefit of the doubt, that I finally felt safe. And those were, godsends to me. The one, and I'll name him because I love him, Phil Cushman. He's a genius.
Praise Phil.
Yeah, you knew Phil.
He was so great.
Yeah, I mean,
I still quote Phil to this day.
Yeah. What quote do you use from him?
He has tons of funny jokes about Jews. He also recognized a very famous piece of art, but obscure piece of art, in my office and came in to talk to me about it.
No. And he's Jewish himself,
yes.
So he's not just a non-Jewish making fun of Jewish people, and he's with
a name like Phil Cushman, he's a Jew,
and he's an accomplished author and philosopher and thinker, and he once he befriended me, really. And his office was right next to mine, which, as a colleague. Anyway, point is that Helen and all the rest of you out there who are victims of academic abuse, I don't know the answer.
Can I say some of the answers? So when in my graduate program, it was very psychoanalytic, and I wanted to write my thesis. I wanted to write a feminist thesis about abortion, and I had to advocate for myself, and eventually they found me a different supervisor than the super misogynistic person that everyone else saw. So sometimes there are advocates in the system that you can say, hey, this really isn't a good match. And then also I've been paid to be somebody's outside supervisor. Obviously this is more money, and I want to acknowledge that there's a financial privilege in this, but someone actually sought me out to support them in their queer research because there was no one at their school who could offer it. So you're going to need support outside of the system because the system is crazy. And I've been in some crazy systems. Mental health and academia are two of the craziest systems ever because they're so insulated, and the people at the top, what you'll hear from them is, it's this way, it's always been this way, this is the way that it has to be.
And professors, I found over time, each professor believes they're at the top of the pyramid when they're not. Professors are mid-level pyramid, In some ways, you could argue the student is at the top, right? But every professor thinks of themselves as the master of their domain, because when they walk into the classroom, that's how they're treated. They often have a lot of academic freedom, particularly if you have quote-unquote tenure or actual tenure. And it's without that kind of checks and balances, and if you have something wrong with your personality, which a lot of people do, you can create a lot of problem. But yeah, I'll piggyback what Rebecca is saying is, and I'm reminded, I guess what worked for me was once, even though there were people against me, and it was really only one or two professors and then a lot of people who were just completely milquetoast and were just blank. Like when I would go to these other people who I'm guessing had a level head, they just didn't know what to do and wouldn't say anything out of political worries, even though I think they agreed with me, but they would just flop at, well, let's agree. Let's everyone agree to disagree. I'm like, no, I'm the student. I'm being mistreated. Like, do you not understand? Like what? And it's not just me. There's literally dozens of other people who are coming forward. Like, at the very least, acknowledge that this is happening, but they just wouldn't. Anyway, I eventually found Phil and some others who would support me. And as a professor myself, I actually had a student recently who came to me early in the quarter, and I didn't know her. And she came to me and she told me what had been happening to her in a different. Wasn't my program. It was another program that she experienced this sort of thing. I don't think it was a high degree, but let's say moderate degree of mistreatment by the program, seemingly. And she came to me, and I told her, "Look, I don't know if you're right or wrong because I haven't investigated this situation, but I'll tell you, your story sounds believable. Mm-hmm. There's nothing about your story that sounds, crazy. So, and I haven't experienced anything different or odd about you. And the things she would bring up, she would just be like, well, I've been accused of asking too many questions, and I'm like, well, I haven't experienced that from you. And what's wrong with asking questions? If you have questions, you're paying a lot of money for this education. Like, even if it's too many questions, that's okay. I'd rather have that than students that literally ask nothing when I know that they're confused. And so I had to spend a lot of time over that quarter. And, and she reached out to me specifically, was vulnerable to me. And I, as a professor, recognized maybe this is me 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. Maybe she's experiencing that. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to be that person. And so unless she proves to me that there is something wrong with her as a student, not only am I going to treat her fairly, but I'm going to try to counter what she's been experiencing. So I would spend a lot of time shepherding her self-esteem and her entitlement to ask questions and reinforcing there wasn't anything wrong with her. I didn't see anything different about her as a student. She was actually a really good student. And so finding someone like that can be great. Anyway, Patron Aaron from Philadelphia, they say, I am in graduate school to become a marriage and family therapist. Do you have any tips for graduate students on creating a resume that will be useful for grants, fellowships, work in the mental health field, etc.? I need to apply for some work because I'm now realizing living off of savings and loans is not necessarily the most financially sound idea. My background is in digital media and communications, so I don't have much directly relevant experience. Rebecca, resume help, what would you say?
Well, I used to do this as an exercise in one of my classes, was have people create a one-page resume, which caused all kinds of hoopla. You've never seen people freak out harder.
I believe it.
When I say limit yourself to one page. Let's see what you have to say about
everyone's
yourself.
Self-loathing emerges and
but also everyone's grandiosity of like this one, everyone, they must know everything about me. It's like, actually, this is a professional setting. They don't need to know everything about you. Yeah. So I would find ways in which your job is connected to mental health. So what are your interpersonal skills? What are your advocacy skills? And then actually having a digital media background for most institutions would be very exciting. If you offer to take over that institution's Facebook page, they would probably fall over backwards. So, I would take the job description for one of these jobs and just start playing with what are the ways that you've already done some of these types of work. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I did this exercise, someone said to me, but I don't have any experience. The only job I have is that I worked customer service at a car rental place in an airport. I was like, if you've done that, you're going to be a great therapist, because the job, you're meeting someone on the worst day of their lives who's panicked about something and they just want to go somewhere. Like, that's pretty much therapy right there. Yeah. So it's a lot about reframing. And then there's probably some key words. So you might want to, I'm sure online you can find a therapist resume and, be like an artist and kind of take that framework and take the content that you have and fuse the two.
Yeah. Yeah. People will ask me this frequently, and what I'll tell them is it doesn't, regarding getting a job in the mental health field, your resume doesn't have to be that great. One, because most people that are competing for that job, their resume isn't that great because it's a entry-level-ish job where everyone is recently graduated with their master's degree and by definition has not had much clinical experience. So your resume for work actually just has to indicate that you have the prerequisites, which is you're a post-grad master's level, provisional licensed individual. And
or there's even it sounds like this person is in school, so they'd be applying for BA level positions. And there are...
Right. I'm in graduate school. Right. Yeah. So, are there other kinds of things you could highlight, like what Rebecca's talking about for sure, particularly if you had another semi-clinical job, a BA level clinical job beforehand. But getting a job in the mental health field at an entry-level job as a graduate or as an intern is not hard because the turnover is so high and the pay is so low. Yeah. So if you just wait 6 months, you're pretty much guaranteed that someone's going to hire you. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't worry about resume for working in the mental health field unless you're trying to work for some really specialized group practice. But even then, I find that some of the more upscale group practices in Seattle, which are emerging more and more all the time, seem to hire people, because they'll reach out to me for a reference on a student that's applying to their group practice. And, I'll give a good reference, but it's not amazing. And then they'll get hired. I feel like it's not hugely competitive is the thing. And
Forbes just came out with an article that they believe in the next 10 years, there will be a 75% turnover of people in the medical field. So you're going to get a job.
Yeah. But when it comes to grants and fellowships, then it's completely different because to get a fellowship and I guess more importantly, a grant, you are competing against potentially hundreds of other people. And as a corporation myself that has, granted, which gives me a thought, Rebecca, that maybe there
we are off of speed round right now. Speed round has been turned off.
Maybe there could be a Rebecca scholarship or something.
I'm ready. You want me to review applicants?
Well, it would be all you. Yeah. You, maybe a Rebecca art therapy.
Expressive
student.
arts.
Yeah. Right. But anyway, so I've done that kind of work, and it is very competitive. And so the thing about that is you have to know who the evaluators are,
what they're looking for,
right? And so sometimes it's kind of read between the lines in the questions that they're asking. Sometimes it's the institution they work for. Sometimes it's the research interest of the judges that are judging the scholarships. But generally speaking, and this doesn't apply to everyone, I'll just speak from my own experience, is it's an emotional experience. When I grant a scholarship, I want to feel as good as possible. I don't want it to feel like I'm just handing out a scholarship. I want to feel like I'm giving it to someone that will need it, that will appreciate it, that will use it to change lives. That's what you want to do as you're trying. And resumes you can't really do that in a resume. A resume can be part of it, but getting a fellowship or a grant, it has to do with, the application you fill out or the interviews. And what you're trying to do there is you're trying to convey to you're trying to guess what will move them emotionally. Don't lie, of course, but you're trying to appeal to what they are looking for in terms of granting the scholarship or the fellowship themselves.
And it's a hustle. Know that you'll apply to several and maybe not get any this round.
Right.
And my college, in my master's program, there was one scholarship that was given to a second year student, and it was kind of like the ultimate seal of approval. And I remember when I didn't get it, I was just devastated.
It hurts. And you always want to lower your expectations on those kinds of things. And sometimes it has nothing to do with merit. It just has to do with someone they knew, or the essay they wrote said the right thing, or literally the mood that the evaluators were in when they read your essay. I've read applicants to the program where I know I'm in a bad mood, and I'm pretty sure that it's affecting things. So anyway, let's take a break, and when we get back, we'll actually do speed round.
Speed round.
Hey, Deserving listeners, as you all know, I am constantly recommending that people go to therapy. We all need therapy from time to time. Well, one of the options available that is definitely worth checking out is BetterHelp. If you're looking for a therapist, I would give it a try by going to betterhelp.com/Kirk. Make sure you use the promo code Kirk because you get 10% off your first month, and it really helps us out. As you watch these videos, I know many of you have been motivated to find your own therapist, which is great because you deserve it. And I know also that it can be hard to find a good fit, find the right one for you. Well, one of the options available in terms of your shopping is to go to betterhelp.com/Kirk. I've been told you can start communicating with your therapist in under 24 hours. You can message your counselor at any time. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions. I've also been told that it's often less expensive than in-person therapy, and you should know that this service is available to clients worldwide. So go to betterhelp.com/Kirk to get 10% off your first month today.
All right, back from the break. Anonymous Annual Patron says, as a professor and supervisor, how do you handle requests for letters of recommendation?
Yeah.
I have been applying to PhD programs, and I hate having to repeatedly ask old professors for letters of recommendation, especially because my colleges now have forms that generate emails to the recommenders directly. It's embarrassing that I haven't yet found the right program or haven't been accepted to a program I wanted. I feel like it makes me look indecisive or not good enough to my previous program. And each time I decided to try it again, the time span has grown since they knew me, and the quality of my work is perhaps forgotten. At this point, it's been nearly a decade since I was in school, and I would never ask my current employer for a recommendation. Not a good situation. What do you say, Rebecca?
Well, so I get requests a lot, and I always hope that people reach out to me first and say, could you do this recommendation for me? I actually recently said to somebody, no, I've had no contact with you whatsoever in X amount of years, and I wouldn't feel comfortable. So just reach out to the person first and see if you get a yes. And then I also just remind that person who you are, because that person has met hundreds and hundreds of people. So I was your student 10 years ago.
Send a picture. Honestly. Because I never forget.
Help a person that help the geriatric people out here.
I never forget a face, but I'll forget a name.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and people will do that to me, too. I interviewed you about yoga therapy 10 years ago, and the article's finally ready, and I'll write back and say, there's no way you interviewed me. I'm not certified as a yoga therapist. And they're like, oh, right. You know, we were talking about this. So just remind somebody who you are. And then, you know, just if people will be honest, I think, if they don't have the time or they don't feel that they would be a good fit. And those forms, although they are simple, just know that people are pretty stressed out.
Yeah. What I'll say is you have, as we were saying earlier, you got to hustle, which means that you should ask and don't feel bad about it. And when I've been asked and I turn it down, I don't feel upset that someone asked. You know, I'm not like, how dare you? So regarding the question of like, there's been so much time, I don't want to bother them. You know, it doesn't bother anyone to ask. They can always say yes or no. The other thing is this advocates for the notion of having a mentor in your program that you can rely on in this way, someone that you continue to contact. I just recently received an email from a student that I haven't talked to in months, but she just sort of checked in. She's like, "Hey, how's life? Miss you." And and so it was nice. And that little bit of human, even though it probably took her, I don't know, 3 minutes to write, it was a little touchstone that will stick with me for a while as a professor. And so, if you're one of those, because sometimes people will reach out to me for a recommendation, and I'm like, I barely remember you as a student. Like, you were one of those quiet people, and sure, I read your papers, but I don't remember you at all. So I'm sorry, I can't really provide a because I can look at your papers, and what I'll say is my recommendation will essentially be I don't remember them, but from my records, they were a good student. So, and I don't think you want that recommendation. I'm sorry. So. And over distance learning, it makes it a little harder, but not impossible. The student I just talked about, I only met in person once because I forced the university to allow me to meet people in person after we were all vaccinated. Anyway. So there's that. The other thing I'll say, just kind of a little tangent, is I'm getting so tired of recommendation forms that are being sent to me that take me 35 minutes to fill out.
Oh, no. Really?
Yeah.
I haven't gotten one of those. Thank God.
People get, because when you make a Google form, and I've been a victim of this too. I've created many surveys over the year that were way too long, but people get, they're just like, rate this person in the following 55 areas from a scale from 1 to 10, and I'm just, and then you do that. You're like, oh, 55. Okay, fine. And then it's like, here's another 55 things that I want you to think about how you think they will perform in the future. And it's just like, look, I'm a busy person. 1, 2, I don't know this person that well. Like, who do you think? Do you think this person's my own child? Like, I don't know who. I barely understand. Being a professor doesn't mean I intimately know these people. So. A little tip to you people out there who create those things, just
short and sweet.
Stop it. Another tangent.
Oh, I've got a tangent too, so I can't wait to hear your tangent.
Well, let's hear your tangent first.
So I also have been talking about this with my kiddo as they head off into the adult world, to remember to connect with a professor, with a teacher or two, so that somebody can give you a recommendation in the future. And that people often forget that when they're in graduate school. They don't realize they're going to need those connections later. And so if you're a real cut and run kind of person, those relations, you're going to need, 1 or 2 of those folks. Try and connect so that you don't know where you're going to want to go in your career later. And it's interesting. I think all of my college professors are dead now. But, and I mourned one of those losses.
You killed them.
I killed them just with my misspellings and my improper citings. I was thinking about the one who passed away last year, Laurel Thompson, may her memory be a blessing. Like, that was somebody who really knew me and really pushed me and really changed the trajectory of my career. And we've had colleagues too who've passed where it's like, damn, that person really offered me something. So it's a reminder to make some kind of connection in school so that you can really have a good recommendation, and it's not just someone being like, oh, as I check in my records, this person received a passing grade. I don't remember them ever asking me anything, and when they did came to me, they complained.
Exactly. I'm going to forgo my tangent for the sake of speed round.
Speed round.
Patron Rebecca.
Oh, wait. Also, we're accepting graphics for speed round.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So that we can use on the show art. Patron Rebecca from Sweden says, after listening to your podcast for a few years, I decided to become a social worker. So I enrolled in Psych 1, which includes introductory social group psychology, biological psychology, and psychology as a science. Now, as these are introductory courses, I didn't expect much, but I must give you credit. Now, listening to your podcast has made me aware that my knowledge of psychology, and of course over the years I've read a lot of books about psychology, is far beyond the spectrum of a student reading her first course at uni. because you also have a critical view. It has made me aware of the fact that psychology as a science often has the view of we can prove anything with studies. It's both amusing and disturbing at the same time. I mean, here we are in 2022, and we are still discussing the Harvard experiment and many other studies that have been disproven and questioned of validity. It has made me kind of frustrated. The teachers are more interested in APA format than what we actually are discussing in our papers. So this has made me curious. Is the basic course of psychology the same in the United States? What did you teach your first year students? What about keeping a critical point of view as a student? How can we introduce the science of psychology to new students without falling into the old and familiar? Rebecca, what do you think?
Yeah, this is really a problem. I felt this when I was in my graduate program, that I was learning information that was 30 to 40 years old and didn't really meet what the world around me looked like. I mean, this obviously varies professor to professor, and I tried to get the most up-to-date information for the books that I had students read. And also, if you are talk about presenting and applying for things and all of that, if you are presenting to a conference, your references, I think, need to be in the last 3 years. But this idea in graduate school, we're teaching content that's like 30 to 40 years old. And a lot of times they're teaching therapy techniques that are 30 to 40 years old. I mean, I remember how many students I had that were interested in Jungian dream work. And I was like, that's a great class to take. You're not going to get to use that work for quite a while until you have a client base that has enough ego strength to do that. So yes, the field can be very far behind in the early levels. And even in some of your later classes, you might find that the content's really outdated. I remember my teacher of developmental psychology at the graduate level was obsessed with teenage pregnancy and often referred to it as being such a selfish choice. And at the time, she had so much sway in my life that I didn't know how to speak up. But I kept thinking at the time, like, this is not right. And this is not what we should be focusing on. And now I know, like, that's an incredibly racist, classist interpretation and not trauma-focused interpretation of what's happening. And clearly this woman had her own issues. But there I was, stuck in that class. I mean, she must have brought it up once a class. So, yeah.
What was the subject?
I don't even remember why she kept it. Felt like it fit every time.
Yeah.
I mean, and then like over time I imagined, like, was she not able to have kids and she was jealous, or like what on the earth was going on?
Yeah.
But yeah, your professors won't always be up to date. Some professors write a syllabus and 20 years later they're still teaching that same class, and it is painful.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that critical thinking is a new thing. So there's that as well. I just think that, one, in the field of psychology, as you know, patron Rebecca from Sweden, that we are a soft science, if that, or at least a lot of what we do, particularly in psychotherapy, it's more of an art than a science. And because when you treat cancer, for example, that's a science. It's not an art form. When I'm helping someone to heal from their childhood traumas, it's more art than science.
And can you imagine going to get cancer treatment and they give you the treatment of 30 years ago? That would be malpractice.
Right. Well, yeah. And the art of psychotherapy has been mulled over in some, wise ways over the last 150 years. And so we can still learn from the wisdom of Ferenczi, for example, from the 20s. It's not like medicine where it's completely out of date, is my point. Anyway, a lot of it's out of date for sure. But point is that the insecurity that a lot of people in psychology have is profound, because their entire livelihood and justification for their career, and maybe even their bottom line of being able to pay their bills, depends on this idea that this is a hard science and that there's justification for certain things. Me being a podcaster and a therapist, I don't rely on that. I don't need psychology and psychotherapy to be a hard science in order for me to make money, in order for me to survive as a expert in my field. I mean, there's some things that need to be supported by empirical observation, trauma recovery, this kind of thing, for sure. But the implementation of it, I find to be pretty particular to me, and it's different from... Anyway, point is that there's a lot of this justification. So the fact that you're bumping into that, and I have too, I was trained in forensic psychology, and a good number of my professors, I would ask occasional questions, or other students would ask questions, because we would actually come out of Phil Cushman's class where it was all about hermeneutics and questioning and like cultural horizons and the privilege of power and of white people philosophy. He was pretty good about breaking us down in terms of, you don't know anything about anything because we don't even know why we know what we know. All this kind of questioning. You just come out of these classes, 3 hours of him lecturing. He would just sit down, no PowerPoint. He would have a notepad in front of him. And he would talk for 3 hours, and I'd be gripped the whole time and just be like, what just happened in my head? I feel like I'm coming, upside down out of this classroom. And then we'd walk into the next class, and it'd be someone proposing that you can test someone and know that they're lying, as opposed to, because there's these tests to see if they're malingering, right? Because forensic psychologists are often called upon to go into a prison, someone who is, claiming that they suffer from schizophrenia and want to go to a different sort of facility or have a different sentence. And as a forensic psychologist, you have to come out and of course, if you come out and say, I don't know, then neither the prosecutor or the defense will want to hire you again. So the only people who get hired again are the people who come out and say one way or the other. And the only way you can justify that is if you have some sort of quote unquote hard scientific measure, and they have one for that. And so I would ask questions, be like, well, how do we know that they don't know how to game the test? And they're like, well, because this, and this. And I'd be like, well, how do we know that it isn't like, how do we know? We can't know. We can't get into their head. Like, there's a lot of possibilities here. And they'd be like, because for them, when I ask this question, it completely dismantles their entire justification for their career and their professorship. And they didn't like that. They weren't hostile to me, but they had very, because, they are on the stand, these forensic psychologists, they get called up to the witness stand and are cross-examined in this way. They have very slick ways of responding to this. And so you always just have to look at, Rebecca from Sweden, where the power is. And if the power resides in them upholding a non-critical, self-critical stance, then they are going to propose a non-critical stance.
I mean, also the benefit of this field is that you never stop learning. And so if you've got a professor or an internship you feel like is not up to where you want to be and what you want to be doing, know that you'll get a chance later in your career to do it, and you'll find like-minded people. But that I doubt there are many people out there in our field that haven't spent pockets of time in places that they felt were out of date. I mean, I remember when I was in the Bronx, someone came in to give a lecture on dialectical behavior therapy for borderline personality disorder, and half the older white male psychologists walked out of the presentation saying, why? Because they said it would never work and it was feminist and
what?
Yes, yeah. So
wow.
And that
what was the accusation? I don't even understand.
They were disgusted that their treatment model that they had been doing for 30 years was being called into question.
Which was what?
Who knows? I don't even know what they were offering. But they were saying this will never work. And then I remember 2 years later at the next job that I was at, which was known for being very culturally progressive and had a lot of clients in trauma, we were saying, what's this one? Eye movement. EMDR. Some of us were asking to get trained in EMDR, and our supervisor was saying, there's no research on that, blah, 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 blah. And it was starting to be the standard of care then. And now, I'm one of the few people I know that does trauma treatment that's not certified in it. So it's just interesting. I mean, you will run into roadblocks all along the way.
Yeah. It's a weird field. Like in the medical field, you're not going to find a lot of disagreement. There is some, but you're not going to find a lot. In our field, you'll just find, because again, it's a soft science, because there's no way to prove that one thing is right over another thing when it comes to certain things. Anyway, point is that your other kind of communication here, Rebecca, is from Sweden. You're saying that after listening to the podcast for many years, I find, because it sounds like you're in a BA level course, Psychology 1 sounds like freshman year in college.
Yeah.
Like Psych 101 in the States. And the fact that you feel like you know more, perhaps even than the professor, does not surprise me. I mean,
no.
Listening to this podcast, listening to any quality psychology podcast, not just me.
But this is high quality.
Well, and I try to really, especially my deep dives. You listen to one of my deep dives on a personality disorder, you're getting a higher. I mean, you're getting
people rave about them.
You're getting a higher education than you ever would in graduate school on that topic.
Yeah,
you're not getting a higher education on the whole, but the average, or I would say 99% of, maybe a 99.9% of graduates from a doctoral or master's program does not know as much as you do, dear listener, about, say, attachment theory or borderline personality disorder, because of what I've talked about. And it kind of breaks this myth that somehow graduate school is this magical place where you emerge with just like droves of expert information, and it's just the beginning. It's graduate school is a surface level exposure to dozens of topics that have rich, deep, histories and information. And so the fact that you're like, I've been listening to your podcast a long time, I'm starting to take classes, and I'm just looking around, I'm like, there's a bunch of yahoos in this room. That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. And people come to this field from all kinds of places.
Yeah.
And I just remember when I was in graduate school, I had to take some prerequisites. And so I went to a well-known college in New York City I think it was Abnormal Psych. And he had us read comic books on different topics. I'm sure trying to meet his demographic. The average kid is 19 and he just wants them to pass this class. But, I was kind of shocked. Like, I'm in graduate school right now having to cite APA sources, and I'm reading a comic book to understand Jung right now.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is, you're asking, what do I teach my first year students? And what I'll say is that I, as a professor, I'm teaching with my hands tied behind my back to some extent, because I have very limited time and I have to hit on certain topics. So some students will actually take a class with me and listen to the podcast, and they will come to me and say, "Oh, thank you for doing that podcast about that thing, because now I understand really more what we were talking about in class." I don't have that much time with students in class. So the fact that, so even for me with my students who, first quarter, they still have a long way to go. Let's just put it that way.
And adult learning theory, you have to hear a concept on the average 7 times before you're fully integrated and able to describe it yourself. So just be prepared.
And
throughout your BA and your master's, you'll be like, why are we talking about this again?
Yeah.
And the professors are just trying to get the average student, and you may not be in the middle.
Yeah.
That bell curve, you may, I have an insanely fast processing speed. I get things on the first take. I can't write about them. I'm at the bottom of the bell curve to be able to write about them. But, people are all over that spectrum. And so they're teaching to the average. So they're repeating things 7 times. And, you'll be hitting your head against the wall sometimes. But knowing that you are in a group learning environment, and your peer, on the 7th time, it's just clicking for the first time.
All right. One more.
Speed round.
This is a good one. Listener John says, is it possible to develop normal sexual attractions if my only sexuality is a kink? I'm currently repulsed by normal sex and can only engage in adult baby diaper lover, adult baby / diaper lover, or ABDL, is involved, and I found it very limiting in life. I don't mind having a kink, but right now I feel held back by my fetish. So is it possible to develop normal sexual attractions for some people? Listener John wants to know.
I would hope so. I mean, sexuality is a spectrum and grows and changes throughout your life. And so it would be interesting to explore. I would very slowly explore non-diaper related sexual acts. And even I think, they talk about this between long-term couples. Like, can you find sensuality in just sitting next to each other, or just holding hands, or just kissing for a minute? I mean, you might need to find a lover or maybe a sex worker who could help you do this, is to just touch into non-kinky sexuality slowly and seeing what you like. I mean, it is a spectrum, and if non-kinky people can become kinky, I'd be curious to see, and I know I've seen it go the other way, because kink takes a lot of work. So usually there are people that come in and out of kink as they have time and energy for it.
Yeah. So, John, it sounds like you're not disparaging yourself for having a kink. You're saying, I'm fine with having a kink, but I feel held back. So I don't know what that means. Do you actually feel held back, or do you feel like you might be held back because you hear about other people talk, you imagine the grass is greener kind of a thing?
Can I give another scenario? Yeah. Is they might be limited in how many partners they can find that are into the same kink.
Yeah, that could be, which, I don't hear that, but with the internet today, you could, if you live in a big enough metropolitan area or near one, there's probably a lot of people who would be interested in that. So, or would be open to exploring it. So, sometimes just a matter of finding the right people. So the first question I would ask you, if you were a client of mine, would be, how do we know that you are limited, really? Like, and are there other ways? Because changing one's sexual attraction is hard. And if you can do something else, or try to eliminate any kind of internalized kink shaming that's happening for you, that could be a part of it, or this notion that somehow vanilla sex is somehow more fulfilling, which it might be for you, John, but it might not be. Because, on the flip side, you have someone that is very vanilla and there's a lot of things considered vanilla, I guess, but someone who wouldn't call themselves kinky, let's just say, and they generally, after a certain time in a long-term relationship, you tend to do the same thing every time. Like, that's just the fact. Some people like to mix it up a little bit, but there's usually a repertoire of things that people will do. And in that way, you could say, in the same way that for you, John, you're very frequently doing diaper lover stuff, for a vanilla couple, they're always doing whatever it is that vanilla people do. That's just kind of the way long-term relationships are, even just your own sexuality, particularly as you get older, you kind of get locked in on certain things, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can be limiting, and it can be something to look at potentially if it's causing problems, but just the sheer fact that it's the same thing every time doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it. Of course, society will shame that, as they'll shame anything about sex if you give it enough time. But so that would be the first exploration of, like, is there really a reason that you need to change? Is there really a reason why you have to try to expand things for yourself? The second thing is getting at what Rebecca said, is look at essentially what need are you trying to meet? Because it's possible that with the role play or kink, that you're not necessarily yourself all the time, or you're not your full persona, if you will. And you might be feeling you want to just be loved for who you are without a diaper or something. You just want to have some acceptance or physical contact or something. And it might not be sexual in nature, but might be sensual, physical touch, being naked in bed together, just holding hands, or just kissing or just cuddling or something. And so that would be another thing to think of. It's just like, well, let's go backwards and figure out, is this a sexual need that you're trying to expand, or is this a more general attachment, human touch experience that you're trying to get? Because if that's true, then it really opens up to a lot of different behaviors that don't necessarily involve a sexual act, if you will. The other thing I'll say is, yeah, absolutely, people change for a variety of reasons, their sexual preferences and what turns them on. It happens naturally to everyone to some extent over the years. So can you change that? Absolutely. And the way that you try to go about it doesn't necessarily work, is you just slowly, as Rebecca was saying, just slowly start introducing certain things, and trying to remain open to the fact that you might not be turned on, or trying to associate other things with when you're turned on. And you would work with a professional on how to do that exploration. Essentially, the idea is that if we are malleable people, generally speaking, and if you associate your sexual energy, if you will, with a particular stimulus over and over and over again, eventually your body just gets turned on by that. It's just like the Pavlov's dog. You ring a bell, it starts to drool. With some people, you just have to continue. For example, you do the diaper lover stuff, and while you're turned on, I'm just throwing this out there, but you slowly take off the diaper and you start transitioning to something else while your engine is running, if you will. And then you do that enough times, and eventually that secondary thing becomes a primary turn on for you, such that you don't need to even start with the diaper, that kind of thing. So, and that applies to any kind of transitional space that you're trying to go into sexually.
And it would be interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting for all of us to what else is sexy for you? Especially as you get older, you have to figure out what else is sexy, because what we're trained as what's sexy in our teens and 20s isn't always available to us later, which would be other people in our teens and 20s. So how do you find, I would just be curious for them to, again, just kind of keep a sensuality log. What else is interesting, if this is really a thing that they want to grow into. And I'm sure there has to be a book on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, for some people, they have kinks because of trauma. There's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't mean the kink is pathological. It just gives some sort of background to it. And that once you recover from those traumas, then other kinks or avenues might open up, because it's, the need to have it be a certain way might be reduced with trauma recovery. Anyway, but it's, that I don't want to pathologize what you're going through, John. Anyway. All right, Rebecca, that does it for that speed round. We got halfway through.
Speed round. I'm so proud of us. I love speed round.
Yeah. Next time,
more speed round.
Maybe we'll get done. But there's always a new batch of emails.
I love speed round. Yeah. Mix it up. This is us growing and changing.
To not
opening
yammer so much.
New neural pathways to focus our language and tell shorter stories.
I feel young again. And that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because
you're worth it.